So before we start, um, the beginning of this lecture will be quite theoretical and abstract about the notion of participatory sense making, and this is grounded in what is called enactivism, and it is not easy to understand. And I will also be a bit vague in explaining it because I don't want to go too deeply into it. Um, if you want to read more, there's two papers set up for reading for this week for the people who follow the course, in which we try to explain part of this theory a little bit and make it more applied to interaction design. But there's also a paper in the extra list by Hanne de Jager, who was the person who originally developed this whole theoretical framework of participatory sense making. She's a philosopher. So if you want to read more about that, there's all the opportunity to do so. If you, however, think, oh, I don't understand this, what's this all about? Don't panic, because later on I will give more practical examples that I think relate very strongly to the idea of participatory sense making. But even if you would not necessarily see the connection or understand all the theory behind it, it doesn't really matter because you can also appreciate the designs in and of themselves and think about them and reflect about them. Like, um, what do these designs do for people, right? So that comes later in the lecture. All right, lecture 6, participatory sense making. So this lecture is a bit newer and a bit more experimental than the stuff I've been talking about so far. And it's partly because I've been reading a lot and also talking with a philosopher called Hanne de Jager. And Hanne has developed this framework called participatory sense making, which is based on the one hand on action perception coupling theories, or more precisely, enactivism, which is a particular philosophical um, theory that has been developed by a person called Francisco Varela and various other people. So it's a whole movement within philosophy. And enactivism, on the other hand, she combines the idea of enactivism and with um, ideas on social interaction, so how people interact with each other. And because in this course, we've on the one hand focused on the social aspect of how people make sense of the world, and on the other hand, we have been focusing on this bodily action perception couplings of the last lectures. The participatory sense making framework is actually a nice combination of the two, you could say. So this is why I want to give some attention to that. Um, so to begin with, uh, enactivism is a theory that is originally a biological theory on how the living cell, so the unit of the cell in the biological body, is a sort of autonomous unit, but it creates its own autonomy by constant interaction with the environment. So it's kind of a stable system that maintains its stability by ongoing interactions with the environment. I've already shown this picture of the agent in the environment last time. And so you could say that there's by constantly exchanging interactions with the environment, the agent is maintaining itself. It's maintaining its boundary relative to the environment. And the boundary is not a sort of pre-given fixed thing like the bricks of a house are like a boundary between the inner and the outer of a house, right? That is something you put it there and it stays there. And in fact, if you wait a long time, nature will deteriorate the brick wall of a house, right? A house will never remain a house by itself. It's not actively maintaining itself. But we, our skin and our bodily integrity, are maintained by taking in food, by protecting ourselves from harm, and so on, by taking in energy. And inside, we are constantly rebuilding and reconstructing our cells, right? Because the food that we take in, from that we create new cells and we repair and so on. So we are much more like a big active factory that is uh, actively, proactively keeping itself alive, rather than say a brick wall construction that is just put there by somebody else and then over time just gradually becomes sand again, right? Because that's in the end what it will become if you do nothing. Now, of course, as the Bible already said, we also at some point return to dust, but this is precisely the transition from being alive to no longer being alive. So once we are dead, then we start to become just physical objects like brick walls are. But what, uh, all the time that we are alive, we are keeping ourselves active in a way that actually goes against the laws of nature, because the laws of nature would try to break everything down and smoothen everything out, right? That's the second law of thermodynamics says that if you have something that has a certain structure to it, it will gradually become more random and dispersed. Like if you have a hill, it will at some point become a flat surface. If you everything just becomes more jumbled up and mumbled up and breaks down over time. That's just the way that nature works. But human beings and all organisms, they sort of defy that. And they defy that, they stay far away from this thermodynamic equilibrium, and they do that because they are constantly actively interacting with the environment and exchanging energy with the environment, maintaining their own boundaries. And it keeps up for a while, but not forever, because at some point you die, right? So that is sort of the biological and physical background to enactivism. And then enactivism couples that in the end to the way cognitive systems, so a person who can think and a person who can perceive the environment and make sense of the environment, so everything to do with psychology, they couple that to this basic enactivist self-maintaining cycle. So they say that when I perceive the environment and I act on the environment, I'm still in some way doing this self-maintenance thing. That's the basis of it. And what you get from this interaction is a kind of self-organizing structures. So the what you could say is the sense making, the cognition, when I understand something, this is not something that comes from the inside outwards only. It is something when I see something and I say, oh, that's a chair. This moment of perceiving and experiencing the chair as a chair, that is something that emerges out of the interaction. It is a self-organizing effect of the ongoing interactions between me and the environment. And it's not some sort of pre-given picture that I had in my mind and I'm now putting it out on the outside data that come in from the world. Now, all of this may be a bit abstract, but I will try to move on from here towards more concrete examples, and especially also what could it mean for design to be thinking about interactive systems and technologies from this particular perspective. Now here's Hannah de Jager, Hannah de Jager, and what she says is exchanges with the world, so between us and the world, are inherently significant for the cognitive agent, so that's us, and this is a definitional property of a cognitive system. So a cognitive system is engaged in creating and appreciating meaning or sense making. What we do makes sense. So it's not that things already have a meaning or a sense and we only need to discover it. It's not that a tree is already a tree outside of us and we need to discover it as a tree. No, what we experience as a tree is sort of a it's a sort of conversation between the actual material matter outside of us and what we put into it, right? So this means we are not passively receiving information from the environment, right? It's not that we get data from the tree that goes into our eyes, and then we match that data with an internal model that we have. So we maybe in old-fashioned models, in traditional models of cognition, it was the idea that you would have some kind of registry stored in your brain with all objects that you know, and for every object that you know, there's a list of properties and attributes to that object. So a tree has a trunk and a stem and leaves and color and so on. It has a certain size. So the data comes in from the outside, right? It falls into your eyes, and then you start match that with the registry and say, is it a dog? Is it a lion? Is it which of the objects that I know does it correspond to? Oh, it corresponds quite nicely to all the things that belong to tree. Well, probably it is a tree, right? That would be the traditional idea of looking at this. But that's not what enactivism says. Enactivism says you actively participate in the generation of meaning in what matters to you. And this is two aspects has that. So you generate sort of your experience of the tree. You actively contribute to that, but also it means it's also always has to do something with what matters to you. It has a meaning for you. This refers back to what I talked about last time about the theory of Damasio and the fact that when you are afraid that the lion will eat you, the tree is a very different thing to you than when you are in a burning sun and you need the shade, right? So at those two moments, in the first moment, the tree is for you maybe to climb in, and in the second moment is maybe to sit under, right? So the tree will have different affordances depending on your needs at certain moment to maintain yourself. So things matter to you. They have a meaning for you, and that's how you perceive them. Now, an important part of enactivism is that it's all about couplings of action and perception, and people also interact. They interact with the world, but also with each other, and you could see it maybe a little bit like a dance, or to dancing with another person is literally a form of um, coordination, of course. But you could see maybe all of the interaction that we have with the world as little dances that we do, and we try to sort of make it right. And making the dance right, if you know a bit about dancing, to make a good dance with another person, that is not that you impose your idea of how the dance should be onto the world. And it is also not that you are completely just governed by what the other person is telling you to do, right? You're not completely a passive slave following the other, and you're also not completely uh, prescribing and determining it, right? Even if it is a dance that has specific roles, like the lead role and the follower, even then, uh, for both of these partners, it's not the case that the one is completely determining the behavior of the other. It To say that something is a dance, to use that metaphor, means it is a subtle negotiation, a conversation almost, and in interacting, you sort of feel whether things are right or wrong. You try to get some kind of balance or harmony in the interaction, and then you experience sometimes that there is not harmony, and you need to do more actions to repair it and to get back into a sort of stability that feels good, right? And then at some point when it really feels good, you think, well, now we're really there. That was actually executed it the way I wanted it. That never leads to a good dance, right? So we need to think about the interaction between us and the world, and then also at some point how interactive technology plays a role in that as a kind of dance. Now, Hanne de Jager then speaks much more about participatory sense making, which is um, I can be fully alone interacting with things like bricks or the plants in my garden or what have you. But of course, in many cases, I'm interacting with other people. And even if I'm fully alone, there's still other people in my social network and practice that I'm part of. right? So I'm even if I'm watering the plants in my garden, maybe I'm in the back of my mind be having sensitivity to what other people will think of it or what I've learned from other people. And Hannah describes different degrees of participation, and she says there's not one, it's not either with or without. It's a kind of spectrum. And on the one hand, you have interactions that are more individual, and then other people. So I am making sense of things in that case, like the little girl here is making sense of something, and then other people are more contributing to that. So you could see this as a case in which other people, like a teacher or something, is scaffolding your sense making, right? You're trying to understand the like a math problem, and then the teacher is helping you, standing beside you and pointing you, like, what do you see here? What's going on, right? So the teacher is more a scaffold. On the other hand, there are also cases in which multiple people together are collectively trying to make sense of something, which maybe is more illustrated here. And then you get into the idea of joint sense making. So nobody of these kids really knows what's going on, but together they're exploring, they're doing stuff, and they're looking at what each kid is looking at what the other kid is doing, and as a group they make sense of what is going on. Now, I've been investigating a lot this joint sense-making stuff, especially in context of where project groups or multi-stakeholder or multidisciplinary professionals are working together in a brainstorm session or in a group meeting or creative or co-design session, and I've been looking at how people then interact with each other. And I think this quote by Hannah is very apt to that. It says there's a coordination of movements, and these movements of the body, and it includes also what people say, if these are the tools by which people make sense, then if you do that together, then social agents coordinate their sense making in social encounters. And this is what she calls participatory sense making, the coordination of intentional activity in interaction. So each of these people here in the picture is trying to do something, trying to get a grip on the problem at hand, but they are also coordinating with each other. They are constantly responding to the movements and the utterances of the other people in the room, and together it becomes a kind of a dance again, um, that in the end leads to a joint sense making. So in the end, each of the three will feel like, oh, now we've understood something that we didn't understand before, of my thoughts have changed a bit on this or that. What you also see in this picture, and that is what Hannah did not focus on a lot in her early papers, but what we've been talking about a bit, is how the object, the artifact, in this case a prototype of a water cooler, is influencing this dance, right? So they are sort of dancing around the object, and they are dancing with each other, but they are also, the object is a sort of central point, like a totem pole that the Native Americans would dance around in the caricature movies, right? So the question is, what do objects do in this dance, and how can we design things that help these people to do the dance even better? So this brings us to the role of artifacts in sense making. And we're using now the word sense making instead of cognition or thinking, just to be clear that we're not talking about the traditional model of psychology in which thinking is something that happens only inside your head. We're using the word embodied sense making to emphasize the fact that making sense of stuff is something that happens in the full interaction circle between your brain, your body, the external environment, other people that you're dancing with, so to speak, to continue this metaphor, and the objects, the artifacts in the world that play a role in this. Right? And we've seen a movie on how objects play a role in brainstorm sessions. We've seen here these three guys that I already showed before. We've seen how kids and adults together uh, through objects can scaffold each other, right? So a parent may explain something to a kid by pointing at an object, and that makes it that they don't have to say everything in words. They can just show, and the children can imitate and then learn from it, and so on and so forth. But also consider the blind man again with his cane. We've talked about how the blind man and the cane, how the cane is sort of an extension of the body of the blind man, and the blind man feels the world through the cane. And this is an individual kind of thing. But now consider that everybody else who can see is seeing this cane and how they respond to it as well. So you see that the cane is not just an individual object of this blind man. It is also, it changes the way the blind man interacts with other people, because other people will already sort of step aside or approach the person or ask something because they see the cane. So the cane has multiple uses, right? It also helps in a participatory way. Now I want to show a little movie on how Skype or any other video conferencing system that we are using now a lot. In this movie, you can see actually the limitations of this medium, and you can see how sitting on a chair in front of a desk on which you have a laptop with Skype, like, and sitting in the way that I'm now sitting in front of the screen, how this really goes against the whole idea of participatory sense making, and it's much more focused on the traditional cognitive idea of, oh, when we communicate, you and me, I will look into the camera for that, then this means that we are exchanging messages between two minds, right? So it's my internal thinking and your internal thinking, and we communicate just by sending out words to each other. And my words go out of my mouth and they go into your brain, and then you interpret it, and then you say something and it flows through the air through this Skype channel, and then it comes from the speakers of my laptop and it goes into my ear, and then I interpret it in my internal brain again, right? So this is the traditional idea of how people communicate. But it makes it really hard to dance, right? Skype sort of makes it hard for people to do this little embodied dance together and walk around stuff and point at stuff and share things in a physical embodied way, right? So the whole idea of Skype is based on the sort of what I see as a wrong idea of what shared or joint sense making is all about. Yeah, we can do it. We've adapted to it. We even came to think that this is the correct way of doing it, but I think that's a mistake. And I will show now how little children actually immediately start to sort of use Skype in a very different way, showing the more natural, intuitive way in which people interact with each other. And then also you can see how difficult that is at some point, or what the limitations of it are.
Melk in een flesje, hè?
Ja. Lekker melkflesje. Ja.
En ga jij dan wel slapen, Gijs?
Nee.
Nee? Ben je dan ook wakker?
Gelukkig niet. Niet. Gijs niet. Gijs niet? Nee. Gijs niet slapen.
Nee, Gijs gaat wel slapen en Teun niet, hè?
Ja.
Nee.
Gijs gaat wel slapen en Teun niet.
Nee.
Nee.
Nee, dus jullie zijn nu lekker brak, hè?
Slapen!
Oh, wat een gekke Teun!
Gijs niet slapen?
Nee.
Wel! Gijs gaat wel slapen.
Ja, ik ook, Jonas. Jij slaapt ook wel lekker, hè?
Alleen niet echt heel erg snel. Niet heel... Jij gaat niet echt... Jij gaat niet slapen in de plaats van Teun. Ik ga niet lang slapen, want ik moet al om 7:30 naar school.
Zo
Ja.
goed?
En ik ga om 12:30 ben ik uit.
Maar om 7:30 begint de school?
Dan
Ja.
moet hij weg. Ja, op
Ja, 8 uur.
8 uur.
8 uur
8
beginnen.
uur.
Tje.
8 uur?
8 uur, Sil. En ben jij weer lekker om 6 uur wakker dan? Of,
Nee.
nee?
Maar ik heb een voorstelling. Dan moet je even wachten.
Oh.
Oké, nou we zijn...
Ga je dat laten zien dan?
Ja.
Oké. Ga ik even kijken of ik dat kan volgen met de...
We moeten niet uit.
Waar ga je het doen?
Ik ga de bank. Op de bank? Op de bank wel.
Oh, dan kan
dat
je
is
ook
een
even
beetje
zonder...
ver weg.
Kan er even zonder stroom. Oh, je kan de stroom even ergens anders in.
Momentje hoor.
Ja, ik vind met Skype is natuurlijk helemaal niet toegerust voor kleine kinderen.
Sil wil jou iets laten zien, Gijs.
Ja, wat ga je doen?
En Sil gaat iets doen.
Nee, ik ga niet van mijn hoofd.
Kijk, daar is Sil weer.
Ik ga net zoals de kangoeroes dingen.
Oh,
Oh.
maar.
Kun je het zien?
Ja.
Laat maar zien, Sil.
Kan jij dat ook?
Oké, we zoeken de grenzen van Skype op.
Oh, dat is leuk. Kunnen jullie gewoon samen spelen zo?
Ja,
Ja, maar ik kan nog niet.
Kijk, want Gijs gaat iets doen en dan ga jij weer wat doen.
Ja, dan wil ik ook. Sil gaat nog iets laten zien. Ik ga nog iets laten zien.
hoe ver kan je gaan met Skype? Fantastisch.
Op de bank. Oh!
Nee, hij staat op zijn hoofd. Hallo. Hallo, Gijs. Kon jij dat ook, Gijs?
Kan jij dat ook, Gijs? Vraagt Sil. Jonas, help je Sil.
Hij kan wel heel goed springen.
Oeh, goed zo. Wow. Wat doet hij allemaal, hè?
Maar ik ga nog eens laten zien. Ik ga nog eens laten zien. Ik kan ook brommelen.
Kijk zo, je moet ook kijken wat Gijs doet, ja, Sil.
Gijs kijken.
Hij doet ook dingen. Oh, wat krijgen we nu?
Nou, wat gezellig. Janneke, zullen we dit elke woensdagochtend doen? Playtime! Oh, leuk.
Fantastisch.
Je kan spelen met Skype.
Now, there have been interesting design experiments thinking about different ways of communicating. And of course, up to now, I've been saying quite abstract things, and maybe it was a bit vague. But to make it very concrete, of course, the first thing you would do if you would try to design for participatory sense making would be to put less focus on verbal and intellectual communication in words, and really go more to the physical body and try to see, can you do something with non-verbal communication? And just because that's often neglected, right? So to focus there is an obvious starting point. And one classical example by Brave and Daly from the MIT lab, the tangible media lab that also Hiroshi Ishii was involved in, is this, who is the director of that, is this very nice example called In Touch, where you have two roller banks and you put your hand on it, and if you roll on one side, the person on the other side feels what you're doing, but also vice versa. So they both, there's a friction. You feel when you roll it, you feel a friction, and the friction is due to the person on the other side also rolling it. So you feel each other, right? It's like being in touch with each other, and this gives a very special experience that is very different from talking with one another. And it always reminds me of that somebody once told me that when we were in college, we just got email. We were one of the first groups of students that got an email address. And I remember a friend of mine who had a boyfriend who lived somewhere else, and they would email each other sometimes just empty messages. So they would just send an email to each other, but without any content in it, no words or nothing. And it would just be as if you would use this device and just do a little poke, like, hey, just to show each other that you are there and thinking about each other. You want to be in touch with each other, right? Which is very different from saying something, right? And Stoffel Coonan, a very good designer from Umeå in Sweden, and also head of the interaction design school there. So if you ever want to try and apply there, this is a very nice design school. And he did a PhD on working much further on this whole in touch idea. And in the end, he made a whole setup with two boxes that people can touch, feel each other by, and he had a whole detailed analysis of how the motors and the actuators were connected. So what exact mapping would you need to make in order to create different kinds of experience, shared experiences, right? Do you want to just add the two signals of the two hand movements together and then give that back, or do you want to mix them in other ways? And also he made a third mediating object, which was a um, light diffracting art object, which you can see here. And that was in the same space. So when two people were interacting with each other, there was also kind of a background light that was affected by it. And that soon people start to realize that they could play with each other and then together create a sort of light pattern. So you then suddenly the focus became of, oh, we are together making this light, right? So you get all these interesting experiences by playing around with how people can interact with each other, which has nothing to do with sending each other cognitive messages. It's just about feeling each other, almost literally feeling each other's bodies. And we did a design project. Bijing, a student, Chinese student of mine who is not in the picture, but she did a whole co-design study with Chinese children. And these Chinese children are children that are called left behind children. And they are children that live with their grandparents or an uncle or a neighbor. And then the real parents are living far away, maybe 500 kilometers away in another city to work. So this is not very nice for the children and for the parents. And what you see in this situation, the many children that are in this situation, what you see is that when the parents call, they call with the phone, and then they have a phone call maybe once a week or every day, I don't know. But very often these phone calls are very strained and not working very well. So father would ask children, do you do your homework? Do you listen to your grandmother? Are you not naughty? And so on. And the children say, yes, pop, yes, pop, yes, pop. And then they hang up, and then it's the end of the conversation. Whereas you could very easily imagine and see it from, and also this came out of the co-design sessions, that what both of these parties just want is to be together. Like parents and children want to be together, and being together is not it has a special quality. It's not just that, oh, if you are together you can easily exchange information about whether you did your homework. It's the other way around. Asking about the homework is just because you don't know what else to ask, right? But actually, you don't want to ask that at all. You just want to hug your child, and at least, and even if the parents are a bit old-fashioned, more traditionally, and more distant, then at least the children want to be close to their parents, right? That this is of all ages and all cultures. So what Beijing designed and what Vincent eventually finished as a prototype for the Dutch Design Week, together with Emil, was an interactive device that would be connected to your phone with Bluetooth, and a device you can hold to your body, and it will become warm when the other person presses it. So if you both press it, it becomes warm on both sides, and you could actually feel each other. And it could also be a watch but we made a thing that would be more like an object that you could hold in the end. Um, and and that, of course, yeah, we don't know if that really will work, or I think it's too crude and too superficial an attempt to solve a very complex emotional problem. But at least it asks, as a prototype, it asks the question of what kind of interaction would really help children and parents for being together, which is really something different than opening a Skype or telephone conversation. I want to give one other example from our own masterwork. So Nienke designed a conversational game for people with non-acquired, with acquired brain injury. So when you have an accident and then after that you have damage to your brain and maybe you can't speak anymore, or maybe you have some form of dementia or other forms of cognitive problems after. And then when you have a partner, very often the social interaction, the communication between you and your partner is very difficult. These are often a bit older people, so they're couples who have lived together for a long time and they have evolved certain routines. So you could see this couple as a kind of very stable practice of participatory sense making, right? You live together in one home and you have all these routines and habits of how you and you know each other quite well. Then suddenly one person gets brain injury and sort of becomes another person in some way, and a lot of topics turn out to be a kind of taboo. So the person who has the injury often does not want to speak about the injury or is denying the injury. It's really difficult to talk about stuff that you really need to talk about sometimes for practical purposes, like medicine or change of therapy and so on, money. So this conversational tool is an example of, on the one hand, a quite cognitive approach because it just deliberately, explicitly addresses topics with icons saying you can talk about this and you can talk about this and this. But there's one more embodied aspect about it, which I wanted to show, which I like, is that people sit on both sides of this thing. And the design, the visual design of this thing and what you do with it is physically getting closer to one another because you start on your own side, putting objects here of topics that you want to talk about. It's like a little game of, it's like a negotiation game about what is on the agenda today to talk about. And then you gradually move your objects further to the center until you agree together here in the center. What is a topic that we both feel is important and relevant and we want to address, right? So you make here use of the physical space between people and of physically approaching one another and coming together in the center, which I liked. Hannah de Jager says you can have this small scale participatory sense making about little things. So, for example, one example that she gives is when you walk in a narrow corridor in a street and you meet somebody else, and especially now with Corona, this is extra relevant. You make this little dance together of who goes on which side, right? So that's participatory sense making in a very concrete moment to moment setting about something relatively simple. Who walks where, right? So you make sense of that together in interaction. But she extends that to much more complex cases. And she mentions things like collaborating in a joint research project, reaching an agreement after group negotiation. But these examples are hard to unpack, she says. And that is because, of course, if you are a scientist about it, you want to break down such complex situations of three people having a business meeting in all the small details of all the aspects of such a situation.